The coffee mug shattered across the floor before anyone understood what had happened. 1 second, Elias Mercer was standing in the doorway of Maybelle's road stop. The next second, his hand had gone completely slack and ceramic exploded across the linoleum like a gunshot. Because behind that counter, behind the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee, stood his father. Harold Mercer, 79 years old, one eye swollen shut, knuckles split open, apron dark with dried blood. Elias's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Who hurt my father?" And the entire diner went absolutely silent. Before we go further, if this story already has your heart pounding, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that diner because what happened next changed everything. The thing about Maybelle's route stop was that it had never once been confused for anything other than exactly what it was. It wasn't charming. It wasn't quaint. The booths were patched with silver duct tape that had been there so long it had turned yellow at the edges. The ceiling fan wobbled on every third rotation like it was reconsidering the whole enterprise. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, and Maybelle herself, God rest her, had been dead 11 years. But nobody had ever changed the sign because nobody could imagine what else to call the place. It sat beside Highway 287 in northern Texas like something the road had spit out and forgotten. Truckers stopped there, pipe workers on their way to the field stopped there. Veterans who didn't have anywhere particular to be stopped there and stayed for hours nursing one cup of coffee while the waitresses pretended not to notice. It was the kind of place where you came when you needed silence more than food, and silence was something the diner had always been very good at providing. Harold Mercer had owned it for going on 22 years. He had bought it after the accident that took his wife, after the years of drifting that followed after his son had disappeared into something Harold didn't have good enough words for. He had bought it because he needed something to tend, a place that needed him to show up at 4:30 in the morning and unlock the door and turn on the lights and get the coffee going before the first trucker knocked. Harold was a small man, 5'8" on a good day, and he'd lost a quarter inch of that somewhere in his 70s. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked with them his entire life, thick through the knuckles, permanently roughened, the kind of hands that could repair an engine or roll biscuit dough with equal authority. He wore the same style of thing, everyday white undershirt under a flannel khaki work pants, boots he'd had resoled 3 times. He moved behind that counter the way a man moves in a space that belongs to him completely, without wasted motion, without showing off. People liked Harold, not in the way that means people found him charming or entertaining. In the way that means he had spent 22 years being reliably decent to strangers, and strangers remembered that in a world that had stopped expecting it. At 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in early November, the diner held 11 people. 4 truckers distributed between 2 booths and 2 counter stools. A couple in the corner who looked like they'd been driving through the night, the woman asleep against the man's shoulder. 2 pipe workers sitting across from each other, not talking, working through plates of eggs with the mechanical focus of men who had early shifts. An old Vietnam vet named Curtis, who came in every morning at 5:58 and ordered the same thing he'd ordered for a decade: black coffee, 2 biscuits, a side of sausage gravy, and always left exactly $3 on the counter, regardless of the total. And then at the far end of the counter, a young waitress named Emily Cross, 19 years old, refilling the coffee carafe and trying to decide whether the tiredness she felt was from the overnight shift or from something heavier that she didn't have good language for yet. Harold was behind the grill. Emily had noticed the bruising around his eye the moment she'd arrived for her shift at 5. And she had asked him, and he had said, "Don't worry about it, honey," in the voice men of his generation used when they wanted a conversation to be finished. And Emily, who had learned from experience that pushing Harold Mercer on something he'd decided not to discuss was roughly as productive as pushing a mountain had let it go. But she hadn't stopped noticing. The way he turned slightly when he thought she wasn't watching so she couldn't see the right side of his face directly. The way he reached for the coffee pot with his left hand instead of his right, which was not his natural hand, and moved a half-second slower than usual. The bruised and swollen knuckles he'd wrapped with athletic tape that he probably thought was less obvious than it was. Harold Mercer had been in a fight, and whatever had happened, he had decided that the diner was going to open this morning like it always opened, and the coffee was going to be made, and the eggs were going to go on the grill, and the world was going to continue turning, because that was the only way Harold Mercer knew how to do things. Emily understood that. She respected it, but she did not stop noticing. Boink. The bell above the door rang at 6:12. Nobody in the diner looked up right away. The bell rang roughly every 4 to 7 minutes during the breakfast rush, and the conditioned response of regulars was to register the sound without turning a kind of ambient awareness that another body had entered the space without requiring visual confirmation. But then the bell stopped ringing and the door didn't close. And the quality of silence that followed was different from ordinary silence. It had weight in it. One of the truckers looked up first. Then, because of the expression on his face, the trucker across the aisle from him looked up too. Then Emily turned from the coffee station and she saw him standing in the doorway, and for a moment she didn't understand what she was seeing. He was enormous. Not the kind of enormous that was simply height or width, but the kind that came from density. A man who gave the impression that more of him existed per square foot than seemed physically reasonable. He was wearing a leather jacket so old the black had faded to charcoal gray in patches, and across the back and arms of it were military patches that had been there so long they'd been washed into near illegibility. He was 58 years old, and you could see all of those years in him, the weathering, the damage, the endurance. His hair was gray at the temples and shorter than it had once been. His jaw was a thing you could break a hand on. Emily didn't know his name yet, but she could see from the way the truckers in the closest booth had gone completely still that this was a man people knew about. Elias Mercer stood in the doorway and looked at his father behind the counter, and the coffee mug in his hand simply fell. He didn't throw it. He didn't drop it deliberately. His hand just opened the way a hand opens when the rest of a person's body is doing something more urgent, when every resource has been redirected toward processing what the eyes are reporting. The ceramic hit the linoleum and exploded. Coffee sprayed across the floor in a dark fan. Nobody moved to clean it up. Harold looked up from the grill. He saw his son. Something moved across the old man's face, something complicated and layered the way a man's face looks when he is simultaneously deeply glad to see someone and deeply afraid of what that someone is about to do. Elias, Harold's voice was measured. Careful. You didn't tell me you were coming. Elias crossed the diner in 5 steps. He stopped at the counter. He was close enough now that the whole right side of Harold's face was visible, the black eye, the swelling along the cheekbone, the small cut above the orbital ridge that had been cleaned but not stitched. Who, Elias said very quietly, hurt my father? He wasn't shouting, he wasn't performing for the room. The question was direct and simple and delivered in a voice so low and flat that it somehow carried farther than a shout would have. Every person in the diner heard it. And every person in the diner knew, in the way animals know before a storm, that the answer to that question was going to change the temperature of everything. Harold set down the spatula. He reached across the counter with his left hand and gripped his son's forearm once firmly. It's nothing, son. It's handled. Your eye isn't handled. Your hand isn't handled. Elias didn't pull his arm away, but he didn't relax either. Who did this to you? Elias, Dad. One word, but Harold Mercer closed his mouth. Emily Cross was watching all of this from the end of the counter. She had her hands wrapped around the coffee carafe and she was holding it so tightly her knuckles had gone white. And she realized she was the only person in this diner who knew the full answer to the question this man was asking. She also realized from the look Elias Mercer turned toward her that he knew she knew. You were here, he said, not a question. Yes, sir. Tell me what happened. Harold said Emily. 1 syllable. A warning, the same tone he used when he wanted a conversation finished. But Elias kept his eyes on Emily. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his expression. He just waited with the particular patience of a man who has learned that patience is more frightening than pressure. Emily looked at Harold. Harold looked at his son. And Harold, for the first time in the 2 years she had worked for him, looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Let her talk, Elias said quietly. Please. That please was what did it. Emily set down the coffee carafe. She took a breath. It was last night, she said, around 10 o'clock. The diner had been nearly empty by 10. Just 2 customers left, both regulars, a retired schoolteacher named Vera, who sometimes stayed late reading, and a night shift mechanic named Dale, who stopped in after his shift ended. Harold had been doing end-of-night inventory behind the counter. Emily had been wiping down tables. The door had opened and 4 young men had walked in. She had known immediately that something was wrong. Not from anything specific, not from the volume of their voices or the way they walked, though both of those things had been aggressive. It was something more intuitive, a reading of the room that she'd developed over 2 years of working late shifts in a highway diner. These were not men who were hungry. These were not men who needed coffee. These were men who were looking for an audience. The loudest one, Emily said, dark hair, tan, expensive watch. He took the center booth like he owned the whole place. Name, Elias said. Emily hesitated. His name, Elias said again, still quiet, still patient, still the most frightening thing she'd encountered in recent memory. Damien Varela, she said. Sebastian Varela's son. Something shifted in the diner. The name itself did something to the room, not fear physically, but the particular tension that came with hearing a name that everyone present had feelings about. Elias's expression didn't change, but Emily noticed that his jaw had tightened by approximately 1 degree. Keep going, he said. Damien Varela had ordered a round of food like he was doing them a favor by being there. His 3 friends had spread across the booth with the territorial ease of young men who had never once been told that space belonged to someone else. They were loud. They were careless. They called Emily sweetheart and babe in the way that was designed to signal that they could not because they wanted anything specific. Emily had been working her way through it. She was practiced at working her way through it. It was when she went back to refill their water glasses, a routine trip, nothing more than that Damien had reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not violently. That was almost the worst part. Not violently, but casually, the way you might stop someone to ask a question with a complete confidence that the action required no permission and would meet no resistance. His friends had laughed. Emily had stood very still. She had learned through trial and error that going still was better than reacting. That reaction gave men like this exactly what they wanted, which was evidence of their own power. You got somewhere to be, Damien had said. I have other tables. Emily had answered. You've got 1 table. He hadn't let go of her wrist. I'm at it. She had pulled experimentally. His grip had tightened, and then Harold Mercer had come from behind the counter. He hadn't said anything dramatic. He hadn't announced himself. He had simply moved with the deliberate purposefulness of a man who had made a decision, and he had stopped directly between Emily and Damien Varela, close enough that Damien had to crane his neck slightly to maintain eye contact. Son, Harold had said, let go of her wrist. Damien had looked at the old man the way a person looks at an obstacle they're reassessing. Who are you? I own this diner, and that's my employee. Let her go. Damien had released Emily's wrist slowly, deliberately, in the way that made clear the releasing was his choice rather than a response to any request. He had leaned back in the booth. His friends had quieted, watching. Old man, Damien had said, you need to go back behind your counter. I think you and your friends need to pay your bill and head home for the evening. I think Damien had said, standing, you need to watch your mouth. He had been standing then, and he had the advantage of 23 years and roughly 6 inches in the absolute certainty of someone who had never once experienced consequences. Harold had held his ground. He hadn't moved back. He hadn't changed his expression. Get out of my diner, Harold said. Damien Varela hit him. He hit him. Elias's voice still low, still quiet, more dangerous for the quietness. He punched him. Emily's voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a person reciting testimony rather than reliving memory, because reliving it wasn't something she could afford to do right now. Harold hit the counter on the way down. Damien and his friends left. The whole thing was over in maybe 4 minutes. Curtis, the old Vietnam vet at the end of the counter, had been staring at his coffee for the entirety of this exchange. He said without looking up, I was here. I didn't do nothing. He paused. I'm ashamed of that. The pipe worker nearest the door said quietly, we all are. Harold said immediately, nobody should be ashamed. The Varela name in this county means that town stays quiet, and I won't have any of you carrying guilt on account of me. Dad, Elias said, just that word. I mean it, son. Harold looked at him directly. This is not a problem for you. You have a black eye. I am 79 years old and I have had black eyes before. Not from rich kids in your own diner. Elias straightened. Not from someone grabbing your employee and putting you on the floor. Elias Mercer. Harold's voice had steel in it now, the old authority of a father addressing a son regardless of the years between them. You look at me. Are you listening? I'm listening. The last time you went looking for justice, the way I can see you thinking about you lost 4 years of your life, and I lost 4 years of you. I did not lose those years to get them back, just to watch you walk out that door and throw yourself at a Varela. The silence in the diner held for a long moment. Elias looked at his father's face, at the swollen eye, at the split across the bridge of his nose that hadn't been there the last time he'd seen him. Who knows about this in town? Elias asked. Everyone by now, Curtis said. News travels in a small county. And what's the feeling? Curtis looked up for the first time. He was 71 wire thin with the eyes of a man who had seen things that had rearranged his relationship to fear. The feeling is that Damien Varela is untouchable. His father owns the county commissioner. The sheriff's wife works for the casino. The judges all got their judicial campaigns financed out of the same pocket. He met Elias's eyes. The feeling is that nothing happens to Damien Varela. That's the feeling, Elias said. That has always been the feeling. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What's the current feeling about me? The question was directed at the room. At the truckers, the pipe workers, old Curtis Emily behind the counter. He was asking it genuinely without irony or performance. One of the truckers, a big man 50-something, who had been watching all of this from behind his coffee mug, with an expression of extremely careful neutrality, said slowly, Word got around you were here about 30 minutes before you walked in. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Word from who? Elias asked. Highway Network. Somebody saw your bike at the county line. The trucker paused. Your reputation didn't follow you in quiet, Mr. Mercer. No, Elias said. It never did. Harold put both hands flat on the counter. Elias, I'm asking you as your father, as the man who raised you, as the man who was very grateful to have you come back from the years you were gone. I am asking you to think carefully about what you are planning. I haven't planned anything yet. You're thinking about it. I'm thinking about my father's face, yeah. Harold's voice dropped. The authority in it hadn't diminished. But there was something else underneath the authority, now something that sounded like a man who was aware of his own age in a way that he wasn't always willing to acknowledge. Son, you were done with that life. I know I was. You swore it. I know. Then think, Harold said, about what it means to go back on a sworn thing. The words landed. Elias received them. The room received them. Emily watched the big man behind her stand very still, and she could see in the set of his shoulders and the particular tension around his eyes that the words had found something real. Then Elias turned toward the door. I need some air, he said. He pushed through the door and it swung shut behind him. Harold let out a slow breath. Emily looked at the door, then at Harold. Is he? He's not gone, Harold said quietly. He's never just gone. He picked up the spatula again. His hands were steady. That's both the thing I love about him and the thing that terrifies me. Emily picked up the coffee carafe again. Her hands were not steady, but she pressed them steady against the counter. Mr. Mercer, I'm sorry, this is my fault for... Emily Cross, if you finish that sentence, I will be very disappointed in you. Harold looked at her directly. A young man put his hands on you without permission, and I stepped between you. That is not cause for your apology. That is cause for his. The Varelas don't apologize. No, Harold said, they don't. He flipped 3 strips of bacon on the grill. The sizzle was loud in the quiet diner. Curtis set down his coffee mug. Harold, he said, I'm sorry I didn't stand up. I've been thinking about that all night, and I need to say it plain. Curtis, I was a soldier once. I'm ashamed. Harold looked at the old man. Curtis Renner, you've been eating breakfast in this diner for a decade. You've tipped every waitress who ever brought you coffee regardless of what you could afford. You've told me where your kids were going to school, and I told you when my arthritis was acting up, and we've never needed more from each other than that. You owe me no apology. I still should have. You're 71 years old. You should have been left in peace, and you weren't. And that's not on you. Outside, nobody in the diner could see what Elias Mercer was doing, but Emily was close enough to the window to see his motorcycle at the edge of the parking lot. She watched him open one of the saddlebags. She watched him reach inside. She watched him pull out a leather vest, old dark, the back panel covered in patches, too small to read at this distance. She watched him hold it for a long moment. She watched him put it back. But before he closed the saddlebag, he hesitated. And it was in that hesitation that Emily crossed 19 years old, who had worked at Maybell's route stop for 2 years and prided herself on reading people accurately understood that whatever Elias Mercer had decided about the kind of man he was going to be for the rest of his life, that decision was currently under renegotiation. He walked back inside. He sat down at the counter. He said to his father's back, "Tell me everything about the Varellas, not what I know from 20 years ago. Tell me what they are now." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the spatula again and turned around. "Order something," Harold said. "This is going to take a while." Unisang. The story he told wasn't a simple one. Sebastian Varela had built his casino empire over 3 decades, starting with a single card room outside of Wichita Falls and expanding through a combination of genuine business acumen and the particular flexibility of ethics that came with operating in industries where the line between legal commerce and other things was frequently blurry. He was 61 years old now, a widower, and by most accounts a man who had learned the hard way that the loyalty of paid men was a commodity with an expiration date and had adjusted his strategy accordingly. The Parker County population, 42,000, ran on Varela money, the way a clock runs on its spring. The casino employed 1,200 people directly. Another 300 worked in businesses that were either owned by, supplied to, or financially dependent on the casino operation. The judges who sat on the county bench had all had their campaigns funded, with Varela contributions through enough layers of separation that nothing was provable. The sheriff, Earl Pruitt, had a wife who managed events at the casino. The county commissioner played golf with Sebastian Varela every Thursday. "It's not corruption," Harold said, pushing a cup of coffee across the counter to his son. "Not in the way people used to understand corruption. It's just weight. Too much of everything in one person's hand. After a while, the hand becomes the center of gravity and everyone arranges themselves around it without any specific understanding of how it happened." "And Damien," Elias said. "Damien is what happens to a boy who grows up knowing the center of gravity is his family." Harold wrapped both hands around his own coffee mug. "He's not evil. He's incomplete. He was never taught that other people were real." Elias looked at his father. "You just got hit in the face by him." "I know what I got hit by. I also know what I saw when I looked at him." Harold paused. "A young man who has never once faced a consequence, not one, who has never needed to develop the character that consequences build. It's not an excuse, but it's a reason. Some people would call those the same thing. Some people would be wrong." Elias drank his coffee. He was quiet for a moment thinking, and it was a specific kind of thinking, the kind Emily recognized as a man working through options rather than reaching for his first instinct. "Sebastian knows what his son did," Elias said. "Or he will." "He knows," Emily said from down the counter. "Damien wasn't hiding it. He was bragging about it. Somebody told me this morning that it went around their circle last night like a party story." "He bragged about hitting an old man," Elias said. "He bragged about putting the diner owner on the floor for getting in his business." Emily's voice was flat. "Those were the words." Elias set down his mug. Something in him had changed. Emily could see it not in his expression, which was still controlled, still measured, but in the stillness of him. The particular stillness of a man who has arrived at a decision and the internal argument has concluded. "What's his pattern?" Elias asked. "Damien, where does he go? What does he do? Who does he surround himself with?" Harold said, "Elias, I'm not asking to find him, Dad." He looked at his father. "I'm asking because I need to understand what I'm dealing with. That's all." Harold Auld studied his son. He studied him the way a man studies something he loves and fears in equal measure, the way parents look at grown children who carry both your best qualities and your most dangerous ones in proportions you never quite manage to control. "Saturday nights," Harold said finally. "He takes a group to the rooftop club on Crockett Street in Dallas. 1227 Crockett. He's there by 9, usually stays until 2, has a reserved table." "You know this." "I know everything that happens within 20 miles of this diner. Always have." Elias nodded. He finished his coffee. He set the mug down with a care that was somehow more concerning than if he'd slammed it. "I'm not going back," Elias said quietly. "Not to who I was. You need to know that." "Then what are you going to do?" Harold asked. I'm going to ask a question, Elias said. One question, to Damien Varella's face, in front of witnesses. That's all. Harold looked at him for a long moment. You know that's not all, Harold said. Dad, you know yourself better than that, and so do I. Harold put his hand on his son's. Just that, just the weight of it. Whatever you're planning on, I need you to promise me one thing. What, come home from it. Elias looked at his father's hand on his, at the swollen knuckles wrapped in athletic tape, at the age in those hands and the strength still in them, in the 22 years of early mornings they had represented, in the 22 years before that when they had reached for him in the dark, when he was too young to name why he was crying. Yeah, Elias said, I'll come home from it. He stood up. He pulled on his jacket. Emily watched him pause at the door. Emily, he said without turning. Yes, sir. You did nothing wrong last night, not one thing. He pushed through the door. The bell rang once. And outside, through the diner window, Emily watched Elias Mercer walk back to his motorcycle and open that saddlebag again. This time he didn't hesitate. He lifted the old leather vest out with both hands. He put it on. And by the time the rumor started working its way through the county, through the trucker network, and the coffee shops, and the text messages passed between people who kept track of these things, Elias Mercer was already on the highway heading north. The rumor was simple. 3 words. Mercer is riding. And in the diner, Harold Mercer stood at his grill and flipped his eggs and breathed in slow and steady and tried to remember the last time he had prayed. He figured now was probably as good a time as any. The rumor moved faster than Elias's motorcycle. That was the thing about small counties in northern Texas. Information traveled. The way weather did not along any particular road or wire, but through the air itself, through the invisible network of people who knew. People who knew people, and by the time Elias had crossed the county line, heading north on 287, his name was already in 17 different conversations, happening simultaneously in diners and feed stores and idling pickup trucks from Weatherford to Mineral Wells. Mercer is riding. Not Elias Mercer specifically, not the son, just Mercer, the name alone stripped of its first half, because in this part of Texas, the last name was the part that carried the freight. Curtis Renner heard it from his nephew 40 minutes after Elias left the diner. The nephew had gotten it from a dispatcher at the truck yard, who'd gotten it from a driver who'd passed Elias on the highway and recognized the jacket. Curtis was still sitting at the counter at Maybell's on his second cup of coffee, and when he heard it, he set his phone face down on the counter and looked at Harold. They're already talking, Curtis said. Harold didn't look up from the grill. I know. Half of them are scared. The other half are... Curtis paused, searching for the right word. Relieved, which might be worse. Might be, Harold agreed. Emily was listening from the end of the counter, where she was rolling silverware into paper napkins, a task that required so little thought that her entire mind was free to be somewhere else. She had been turning the morning over since Elias walked out, examining it from different angles, trying to find the angle at which it made sense. Mr. Mercer, she said finally. Harold looked over. What was he like before? She hesitated. You don't have to answer that. Harold was quiet for a moment. He flipped 2 eggs, set them on a plate, slid the plate down the warming rack. Then he said, he was exactly what you'd expect from a boy who lost his mother young and grew up watching his father work himself half to death and never had anyone tell him that what he was feeling had a name. Angry, Emily said. Angry, yes. But underneath the anger, which was real and it was earned, don't misunderstand me. Underneath, it was someone who wanted very badly to matter, to be someone that other people took seriously. Harold set down the spatula. The brotherhood gave him that. It gave him belonging and structure and a kind of respect that the world had withheld from him. The problem was the price. What was the price? Violence, Harold said simply. The respect came with violence attached. You couldn't have one without the other, and for a long time he told himself the violence was separate from who he was, that it was just a tool he used when he needed to, that he was still himself underneath it. Harold paused. By the time he understood that wasn't true, the violence had gotten into everything, like water gets into a foundation. Curtis said quietly, and now he's spent 18 years building something different, something that doesn't require the violence. Harold picked up his coffee, and a man hit me in the face in my own diner. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Harold said in a voice that was almost too quiet to hear, I shouldn't have told him where Damien goes on Saturday nights. Emily looked at him. But I did, Harold said, because I'm his father, and because, he stopped. Because there are limits to what a man can watch happen to his own people and still call himself a man. Sebastian Varela got the call at 8:47 in the morning. He was in the office of his casino's administrative building reviewing quarterly licensing documents with his operations manager when his personal phone buzzed with a name he hadn't seen in a very long time. He looked at the name on the screen for a moment. Then he told his operations manager to leave and he answered the call. Marcus, he said. The voice on the other end was graveled and unhurried, the voice of a man in his early 60s who had spent a long life in situations that had burned away every unnecessary thing. You heard Mercer's boy is riding. I heard it 20 minutes ago. Then you know why I'm calling. Sebastian leaned back in his chair. He had a particular habit when he was thinking through something serious of going very still. Not the stillness of a man suppressing movement, but the stillness of a man for whom thinking required the same concentration as physical work. People who negotiated with him had learned to read that stillness the way sailors read a dropping barometer. It meant something was being decided. Tell me what my son did, Sebastian said. Exactly, from the beginning, Marcus told him. Exactly, from the beginning. Sebastian listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. He hit Harold Mercer, Sebastian said, in Harold Mercer's own diner, in front of witnesses. Because Harold Mercer told him to let go of a waitress. That's the whole of it, yes. Sebastian turned his chair toward the window. Outside the casino parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, just the maintenance crews and early shift employees. He had built that parking lot. He had built everything visible from this window, and a great deal that wasn't. My son, Sebastian said slowly, put his hands on Harold Mercer. He did. Harold Mercer, who is 79 years old and who owns a roadside diner. Yes. And now Elias Mercer is riding. Yes. Sebastian pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Marcus, tell me something honestly. If I can. If Elias Mercer comes for my son, and I mean comes for him in the old way, the way he used to operate, do we have enough people who are actually loyal versus loyal to the paycheck to hold a line? There was a pause on the other end of the line that answered the question more clearly than words would have. That's what I thought, Sebastian said. All right, set up a meeting. With Mercer. With Mercer. Sebastian stood. And Marcus, do not tell my son about this call. Do you understand me? Not one word. See. Damien Varela did not hear about Elias Mercer until 11 in the morning, and when he heard it, his first response was to laugh. He was in his apartment in downtown Fort Worth, a penthouse apartment, 15th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, still in yesterday's clothes, sprawled on a sectional couch that cost more than most people's cars, watching financial news on a screen large enough to qualify as a piece of furniture. His friend Jordan, one of last night's group, was across from him, eating takeout and scrolling his phone. Hey, Jordan said. Dude. What? You know that old guy from the diner last night, Mercer? Damien glanced over. The one who got in my face, yeah. His son is like, riding. Riding what? His motorcycle. Like he's coming. For you. Jordan set down his food. His expression had shifted to something more uncertain than he probably wanted to show. Damien, his son, is Elias Mercer. The name landed differently than Jordan's tone had suggested it would. Because Damien Varela, for all the ways in which he had been shielded from consequences, had grown up in a family that operated in a world where names were currency, and he had heard Elias Mercer's name since he was a child. Not clearly, not with details. But the way you hear a word in another room, you catch the sound of it, and you catch the tone of the people saying it, and the tone told you everything you needed to know. He sat up. That's a joke, he said. I'm looking at 3 different messages right now saying the same thing. Damien took Jordan's phone. He read the messages. Then he set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked up his own phone and called his father. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. He texted, call me now. It's about last night. He set his phone face up on the cushion and stared at it with the focused attention of someone waiting for a bomb to either detonate or not. Jordan said carefully, so, are you worried about this? No, Damien said, because you seem, I said no, Jordan. Jordan went back to his takeout. Damien went back to looking at the ceiling. His phone sat silent. His father didn't call back for 4 hours. By noon, Elias had made 3 stops. The first was at a roadside gas station 20 miles outside of Weatherford, where he filled his tank and made a phone call that lasted 6 minutes. He said very little during those 6 minutes. He listened considerably more. When the call ended, he stood beside his motorcycle for a moment, with his hand resting on the seat, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man receiving news he already knew was coming. The second stop was at a storage facility off Highway 180. He had rented the unit 4 years ago when he'd moved back to Texas after a decade in New Mexico, and he hadn't opened it in over a year. He opened it now. He spent 40 minutes inside. He left carrying nothing or nothing visible, but when he got back on his motorcycle, the set of his shoulders was different. Something settled, something resolved. The third stop was at a diner in Mineral Wells called the Bluebird, which had been operating under that name since 1974 and had changed ownership twice since then, but never the coffee which remained definitively beloved by everyone who drank it. He took a booth in the back corner. He ordered coffee and eggs. He waited. The man who slid into the booth across from him 20 minutes later was 63 years old, built like something that had been put together for industrial purposes, with a gray beard trimmed to a precise half-inch and eyes the color of old nickels. His name was Terrence Webb. He went by Webb. He had known Elias Mercer for 31 years, which meant he had known him since before the violence and through it and out the other side. And there were approximately 4 people on Earth whose read of Elias's internal state Elias trusted completely. Webb was one of them. Webb looked at him across the table. He looked specifically at the leather vest. "You put it on," Webb said. "I put it on. Does that mean what I think it means? It means my father has a black eye and I need to have a conversation with a 23-year-old boy who has never heard the word no from anyone he couldn't buy or ignore." Webb wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "And after the conversation depends on the conversation." Elias? Webb. Don't play word games with me. I've known you 30 years. When you put on that vest and you use words like conversation, I know what we're actually talking about. Elias looked at him steadily. "I'm not going back to who I was." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm protecting my father, that's all. And if protection requires, I'll cross that bridge." Elias paused. "I need to know who's still around, who I can call if the situation develops past what I can handle alone." Webb was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking which was a different thing. The chapter's been quiet for 6 years. Most of the old crowd have moved on. Some have died, some are in worse places. He paused. But there are still people who would ride for Harold Mercer's son. There are still people who remember what Harold did for this community when he ran the road stop as something more than a diner. "I know what he did." "Then you know the loyalty runs deep." Webb looked at him. "How deep does the problem go?" "Sebastian Varela runs the county. His son is the specific issue. But if I push on Damien, Sebastian pushes back, and Sebastian has enough institutional control that pushing back can look like a lot of things. Police trouble, licensing issues, harassment that never rises to the level of anything you can point at directly. So you need to push on Sebastian." "I need to have a conversation with Sebastian," Elias said. "A different kind of conversation than the one I need to have with his son." Webb was quiet again. "You know Sebastian Varela's history. You know what he came from." "I know he came from the same world we came from. Different side of it." Webb drank his coffee, made a face. The coffee was genuinely terrible. "Word I have from a reliable source is that Sebastian is already aware of what his son did, and that he is not happy." Elias looked up. "Who's the source? Reliable?" "Webb. Someone in Sebastian's operations who has reasons of his own to keep certain channels open." Webb set down the mug. "The word is that Sebastian is embarrassed, which for a man of his position and his particular vanity, embarrassment is something he takes very seriously. Embarrassed enough to do something about it. That's the question, isn't it?" Webb paused. "There's something else." The pause before those words had a weight in it, the kind of weight that meant what followed was not incidental. "There's a man named Rico Salazar," Webb said. Elias was still. "You know him," Webb said. It wasn't a question. "I know the name." Elias's voice had gone careful. "From 25 years ago, he was running transport operations out of Wichita Falls We Are People and the Varela organization both shut him down. He was running girls, Webb said flatly. Runaways along the highway. We shut him down as a polite way of saying we dismantled his entire operation and put him in a position where he had no organization, no assets, and enemies on both sides. He should have nothing left. He rebuilt, Webb said, quietly, over a long time. He's been running a smaller operation for the last 8 years, moving through the cracks between territories. He's smarter than he used to be, more patient. Webb looked directly at Elias, and 3 sources have told me independently that Rico Salazar has been spending time in Parker County for the last 4 months. The diner was quiet around them. A waitress moved between tables. Someone's coffee cup clinked against a saucer. He's been here, Elias said. He's been close. And Damien Varela picks a fight with my father's diner exactly now. I'm not saying it's connected, Webb said. I'm saying I don't know that it isn't. Elias sat back. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice. If Rico's been working the area, Elias said slowly, and if he wants to reignite the old conflict between our people and the Varelas, then an incident at a diner, a Varela kid hitting a Mercer riding in response. Webb's voice was quiet. That would be a very good way to start a fire. He'd have to have gotten to Damien somehow, influenced him. Damien Varela doesn't require much influence to behave badly. You just have to make sure he's in the right place, at the right time, in the right state. Drunk, Elias said. His friend said he was drunk. Yes. And where he was drinking before. Would be worth knowing, Webb agreed. They looked at each other across the table. The implications of it were still assembling themselves piece by piece into something that hadn't yet reached the level of certainty, but was moving steadily in that direction. If Rico engineered this, Elias said, then going after Damien is exactly what he wants me to do. Yes. And going after Sebastian escalates it. So what do I do? It wasn't a rhetorical question. Elias asked it the way a man asks when he genuinely wants another person's answer. I think, Webb said carefully, that you need to talk to Sebastian Varela before you talk to his son. And I think you need to do it before Rico understands that you've identified the shape of what he's doing. Sebastian won't meet with me. He might. Webb hesitated. He reached out. Elias went still. What? Through Marcus, about an hour ago. Webb met his eyes. Sebastian Varela wants a meeting. The meeting request traveled to Elias through 3 intermediaries in the span of 2 hours. Each one more careful than the last, the message stripped down with each relay until what finally reached him was its barest form. Sebastian Varela. Neutral ground. Tonight. He chooses the location. Elias sat with that for a long time. He called Harold. I need to tell you something, he said when his father answered, and I need you to listen without telling me to come home. Harold was quiet for a moment. That's a hard ask. I know. Tell me. Elias told him. Not everything, not the Rico information, not yet, because he didn't want his father sitting with that alone in a diner where Rico may or may not have assets positioned nearby. But he told him about the meeting request. He told him what he knew about Sebastian's awareness of the situation. Harold was quiet for a long time when Elias finished. Sebastian Varela requesting a meeting, Harold said finally. That's not nothing. No, sir, it isn't. Sebastian doesn't request meetings unless he's recalibrating, unless something has shifted in a way that changes his calculation. Harold paused. The question is what shifted? I think it might be deeper than Damien hitting you, Dad. How much deeper? I'll know more after the meeting. Harold said, Elias, be careful. I'm always careful. You are not always careful. You are occasionally careful and frequently effective, which are related but not the same. A pause. Take Webb with you. I was going to. And Elias? Yeah. Whatever happened 25 years ago, whatever history exists between the Mercer name and the Varela name, Sebastian knows both sides of it. Don't walk in there assuming you have the full picture. What does that mean? Harold was quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable. It means, he said finally, that there are things from that time that I've never told you. Things I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you, and I kept waiting because the right moment never seemed to arrive, and now it has arrived in a very inconvenient way. The diner sounds were audible in the background on Harold's end. The grill, the bell, the low murmur of the lunch crowd. Dad, Elias said. What things? Come back tonight, Harold said. After the meeting. Come back and we'll talk. Tell me now. I'll tell you tonight. Harold's voice was firm. Because I need to look at you when I say it. Because some things you shouldn't hear through a telephone. Elias was quiet. All right, he said. He hung up. He looked at Webb across the diner table. Webb had been watching him through the entire call with the particular patience of a man who understood that the call was more important than anything Webb could add to it. He knows something, Elias said, about the history between our families and the Varellas. Harold always knew more than he said. He said there are things he's never told me. Webb absorbed this. That's interesting. Yeah, Elias said. That's one word for it. He stood. He put money on the table. He picked up his helmet. Set up the meeting with Sebastian, he said. Neutral ground like he wants. The old Bluebell truck stop off 180, the back lot. Public enough that nothing stupid happens. Private enough that we can talk. Tonight. Elias paused. And Webb, keep the Rico information quiet for now. Don't let it move through the network. If Rico is watching, and I think he is, I don't want him knowing we've connected the pieces yet. Webb nodded. And if Sebastian brings it up himself, Elias thought about that. If Sebastian brings it up himself, he said, then we'll know exactly how much he already knows, which will tell us a great deal. He walked out of the Bluebird Diner into the November light, and the rumor was still moving ahead of him, still rippling outward through the invisible network of people who paid attention to these things. And somewhere in that network, Rico Salazar was listening too, following the shape of the thing he had set in motion, watching the pieces move toward each other with the patient satisfaction of a man who had been waiting very long time for his particular kind of revenge. What Rico hadn't accounted for was this: Elias Mercer had spent 18 years becoming a different kind of dangerous, not the kind that moved fast and hit hard and left wreckage in its wake. The kind that listened, the kind that understood, the kind that could walk into a meeting with a man like Sebastian Varela and know before the first word was spoken what the meeting was actually about. And as he pulled back onto the highway and opened the throttle and let the bike find its speed in the cold November air, Elias Mercer was already thinking 3 conversations ahead. His father was waiting, Sebastian Varela was waiting, and somewhere in the dark geography of Parker County, Rico Salazar was waiting too. The question was, who ran out of patience first? The Bluebell truck stop off Highway 180 had been closed for business since 2019, which made it exactly the kind of place where 2 men who needed privacy could talk without an audience. The pumps had been removed. The canopy over the old fueling lanes still stood, and the building itself was intact, just emptied, just dark, just a concrete shell that the county hadn't gotten around to demolishing yet. The back lot was wide and flat and visible from 3 directions, which was precisely why Elias chose it. Nobody could approach without being seen. Webb arrived first, which was always the arrangement. He parked his truck along the east side of the lot and sat in it with the engine off and his window down, reading the darkness. The way men who had spent decades in situations that required reading darkness learned to do, not just looking at it, but listening to it, feeling the quality of it, noting what was in it and what wasn't. What wasn't in it, thankfully, was any indication that this was anything other than what Sebastian had presented it as: 2 men who needed to talk without their respective histories, turning the conversation into something it didn't need to be. Elias arrived 7 minutes after Webb. He cut his engine at the edge of the lot and walked the last 50 feet. Force of habit. You arrive quiet, you get to hear what's already happening before anyone knows you're there. What was already happening was one black SUV parked in the center of the lot, engine off, one man standing beside it. Sebastian Varela looked exactly like his photographs, which was itself a kind of accomplishment, since most men who'd spent 3 decades in the casino industry looked considerably worse in person than their promotional material suggested. He was 61 years old, medium height, with the kind of compact physical presence that came from a man who stayed in shape not out of vanity, but out of discipline. His hair was silver gray. His coat was expensive, but not ostentatious. He was alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or the most sophisticated kind of threat: come here with no visible muscle and let the other man wonder whether the absence of muscle means there's nothing to worry about or everything. Elias walked to within 10 feet and stopped. They looked at each other. Mr. Mercer, Sebastian said. Mr. Varela. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Thank you for asking, Elias said. Most men in your position wouldn't. Most men in my position didn't have their son put Harold Mercer's face into a counter. Sebastian's voice was even controlled and carrying beneath the control a current of something that Elias after a moment identified as genuine anger. Not performed anger. Real anger turned inward at something Sebastian was holding himself responsible for. I owe you an apology, and before anything else is said, I want to make that clear. Elias was quiet for a moment. This was not the opening he had prepared for. I hear you, Elias said. I'm not asking for anything from that apology. I'm not using it as a negotiating position. What my son did was wrong. It was cowardly. It was the act of a boy who has been allowed to behave like a child for 23 years because the people around him, including me, failed to draw lines that meant something. Sebastian paused. I am saying this because it's true, not because I want something. Elias looked at the man across the lot from him. He had spent the drive here building a model of who Sebastian Varela was, built from secondhand information and old history in Webb's intelligence, and the man standing in front of him was fitting that model in some ways and not fitting it in others. You said you owed me an apology, Elias said. You didn't say you owed my father one. Sebastian absorbed this. That's fair. I owe Harold Mercer a direct apology that I intend to deliver in person if he'll allow it. That's his call. Yes, it is. What do you want from this meeting, Mr. Varela? I want to understand what you're planning to do. Why? Because depending on what you're planning to do, I either need to get out of the way of it, support it, or talk you out of it. Sebastian's voice was straightforward. And I'd like to know which before the situation develops further. Elias studied him. You know about Rico Salazar? The name landed exactly as Elias had intended it to, as a test dropped without preamble, watching the other man's face for the millisecond before his expression was managed. What Sebastian's face did in that millisecond was not surprise. It was something closer to confirmation, the expression of a man who had been carrying a suspicion and just had it validated. I've been aware of Rico's presence in the area for approximately 6 weeks, Sebastian said. I've been trying to verify whether his presence was coincidental. And it is not coincidental. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He's been in Damien's circle, peripherally, through a third party, a man named Derek Pham, who runs a bar on the south end of Fort Worth and has been buying Damien's social group with free bottles and VIP access for 3 months. Who is Derek Pham to Rico? Distribution infrastructure, the same thing Pham was 20 years ago before the operation was shut down. Sebastian looked directly at Elias. I should have caught it sooner. I didn't because I wasn't looking at my son's social life carefully enough. And because I didn't, my son walked into Harold Mercer's diner drunk and angry and with Rico's fingerprints all over the evening. Elias was quiet. The shape of it was becoming clearer, the way Rico had built the trigger mechanism, slowly, carefully over months, positioning Damien like a loaded weapon, pointed in exactly the direction that would do the most damage. He needed the incident to be public, Elias said. He needed witnesses. He needed the story to get out. He needed Mercer to ride, Sebastian said. He needed exactly what happened. And if I'd gone straight at Damien, war Sepolan, Sebastian said simply, our people on one side, your people on the other, the way it almost was 25 years ago before Harold and I found a way to prevent it. And Rico moves through the chaos, reestablishes his operations. We're too busy burning each other down to pay attention to what he's actually doing. Elias turned this over. It was elegant in the way that genuinely terrible plans were sometimes elegant, minimum input, maximum damage, and the architect invisible behind the people he'd maneuvered into position. He has more operation here than just Pham, Elias said. The network is larger than what shows. I believe so. I haven't been able to map it fully. My people are working on it. Elias paused. We need to share what we have. Sebastian nodded. Once, direct. Agreed. And Damien. Elias's voice shifted when he said the name, not harder exactly, but more specific, the way a man's voice shifts when he moves from the general to the particular. That situation doesn't just disappear because the context is more complicated than it appeared. No, Sebastian said. It doesn't. He hit my father. He did. He hit my father in my father's own diner because my father protected a 19-year-old waitress from being grabbed by a drunk kid who has never in his life had to reckon with what that behavior actually costs. Sebastian didn't flinch. He received this the way a man receives something he knows he deserves to receive. What do you want, Elias? The use of his first name was noted. I want your son to understand what he did, Elias said. Not from a lawyer, not from a check written to make it go away. Not from a conversation where you explain to him that he embarrassed the family and needs to be more careful. I want him to understand it the way a man understands something, because he's been made to sit in the presence of what he damaged and reckon with it. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to arrange than it sounds. I know. Damien doesn't respond well to Mr. Varela. Elias's voice was level. With respect, I don't care what Damien responds well to. I care what changes him. Those are different questions. Sebastian looked at him, and in his expression behind the control, behind the calculation, Elias saw something he hadn't expected to find there. Not resistance, not defensiveness, something that looked a great deal like a father who was tired of being helpless about his own child. What are you proposing? Sebastian said. I am. Back at Maybell's, the dinner crowd was thin. Harold had stayed open until 9, which was later than usual, because he didn't know what else to do with himself, and the diner was the one place where he knew exactly who he was and what was required of him. Emily had stayed too, not because she was scheduled, but because she had looked at Harold Mercer moving behind his counter with the careful, over-controlled movements of a man managing pain, and decided that leaving was not something she was capable of doing in good conscience. She was wiping tables near the window when the black SUV pulled into the parking lot. She recognized it as a Varela vehicle before she recognized the man who got out of it, because she had seen the same model and the same color parked outside the county commissioner's office enough times to register it as a pattern. Her hand stopped moving on the table. Harold looked up from the counter. The door opened. Sebastian Varela walked into Maybell's route stop alone without his driver, without any of the infrastructure of power that usually accompanied him in public spaces, wearing the same coat he'd worn to the meeting with Elias 2 hours earlier. He stopped just inside the door. Harold looked at him across the diner. The bruise around Harold's eye had gone from red to purple in the hours since morning. The split above the orbital ridge was still visible. Sebastian looked at Harold's face for a long moment. Harold, he said. Sebastian, Harold said. The two men regarded each other. There was history in that regard, layered history, complicated history, the kind that accumulated between two men who had orbited the same geography for 3 decades and never quite found a clean way to categorize what they were to each other. I came to apologize, Sebastian said. Harold set down the rag he was holding. Come in then. Coffee. Please. Sebastian sat at the counter. Harold poured. Emily retreated to the far end of the counter and tried to become invisible, which she was old enough to understand she was failing at. What my son did, Sebastian began. I know what your son did, Harold said. I was there. Then let me say that it was wrong and that I am ashamed, and that the shame I'm feeling is compounded by the understanding that I created the conditions for it. Sebastian wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. I raised a boy who didn't understand that other people were real. I'm not looking for absolution. I'm stating a fact. Harold looked at him. Sebastian, how long have we known each other? 31 years, give or take. In 31 years, have you known me to waste time on conversations that didn't lead somewhere useful? Sebastian almost smiled. No, then stop making speeches and tell me what you and my son worked out. Sebastian looked at him for a moment. Then he said, your son wants Damien to come to this diner. 30 days. Every morning before open and through the lunch shift, not as a customer, not as a supervised visitor, as an employee. Harold was very still. He works, Sebastian continued, dishes, tables, the grill, if you'll trust him near it. He gets paid nothing. He is given no special treatment, no protection detail, no Varela name used to smooth anything over. He comes here as what he is, a 23-year-old who owes a debt, and he learns what that means. Emily from the end of the counter was staring at her coffee carafe. Harold said, and if he refuses, he won't, Sebastian said. Sebastian. He won't, Sebastian repeated, and the certainty in his voice was the certainty of a man who had already had the conversation with his son that produced that certainty, and the conversation had not been gentle. Harold picked up his own coffee. He drank. He set it down. He hurt that girl, Harold said, nodding toward Emily. I know. If he sets foot in my diner and he says one disrespectful thing to her, one word, one look, one tone, he's gone. No second discussion. Understood. And he works, Harold said. Not pretend works, not shows up and stands around. He works. He does whatever I tell him to do, and he does it without complaint. And when customers are rude to him, the way customers are sometimes rude to people who work in diners, and they will be rude to him because this county knows his name, and what he did, he absorbs it, because that is what people who work in service absorb. Sebastian said quietly, Harold, is this about changing my son? What else would it be about? Some people would call it punishment. Some people would be wrong. Harold looked at him directly. Punishment is about making someone suffer in proportion to what they did. I have no interest in suffering. I have interest in whether your son is going to spend the next 40 years of his life running the same play, walking into rooms and taking up all the space and treating whoever's smaller than him like furniture, or whether he has enough actual human material in him to become something different. Harold paused. Because if he has the material, I can work with it. I've been working with young people who needed shaping for 22 years. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, dropped, lost some of the control. He has the material, Sebastian said. I believe that. I have to believe that. But nobody has ever, he stopped. Nobody has ever treated him like the material mattered. They've either been afraid of his name or they've been paid by it. Nobody has ever just, he stopped again. Told him the truth, Harold said. Yes. Harold nodded. Once. All right, Monday morning, 6 a.m. He knocks on the back door, not the front. He wears work clothes. And Sebastian. Yes. You don't come with him. You drop him off a block away and you drive in the other direction. This only works if he's here without the Varela name standing behind him. Sebastian looked at Harold Mercer across the counter for a long time. Why are you doing this? He said finally. I'd understand anger. I'd understand a lawsuit. I'd understand a great many things that would be proportionate to what happened. Why this? Harold picked up the rag. He went back to wiping the counter. Because I'm 79 years old, he said, and I have watched enough young men become old men to know that the ones who never got the right lesson at the right moment carry it their whole lives like a stone in their chest. And I'm tired. I'm tired of watching that happen. If there's a chance that 30 days in this diner does something real for your son, then 30 days in this diner is what I have to give. Sebastian Varela left Maybelle's route stop 20 minutes later. Emily watched him go. Then she turned to Harold. He's going to be terrible, she said. Probably, Harold agreed. He's going to be rude and difficult, and he's going to think this is beneath him. Almost certainly. And you're going to just be patient with him. Harold looked at her. Emily, what changed you in whatever ways you've been changed that were worth changing? She thought about that. People who didn't give up on me when I made it easy for them to. There you go, Harold said. Damien Varela found out about the arrangement at 11 that night. His father called him, not texted, called which in the Varela household was reserved for things that were not open to negotiation. Damien answered on the second ring. He had been in his apartment since morning. The same apartment, the same sectional couch, Jordan having left around 6, and nobody else having come by because the text messages that had been arriving all day about Elias Mercer had made Damien's social orbit contract considerably. People who liked being near power moved away from it when it looked like it might attract trouble. Damien had noticed this and filed it away in a part of himself he wasn't fully ready to look at. Dad, he said, you're starting Monday morning at Harold Mercer's diner, his father said, without greeting, without preamble, silence. You're going to work there for 30 days. No pay, no special treatment. You'll take the back entrance at 6 in the morning and you'll do whatever Harold Mercer tells you to do. Dad, his voice had gone careful. That's not something I'm going to. Damien. One word, the same word Harold had used with Emily that morning, the same single-syllable weight of a parent who has decided something. You're serious. I made an agreement with Harold Mercer tonight, and through Harold Mercer, an agreement with his son, which is an agreement I am treating with considerably more gravity than I would treat most legal contracts. You made an agreement about my life I made an agreement about your behavior, Sebastian said, which affects more than your life, which has already affected a 79-year-old man who stood between a girl in your hands and paid for it with his face. Damien was quiet. The word hands had landed somewhere. You're going, Sebastian said. Monday morning. You will be respectful. You will be punctual. You will not use my name. You will not reference my name. You will not allow yourself to be referenced by my name in that space. You are Damien, not Damien Varela, not Mr. Varela's son. Damien who is paying a debt. For how long? 30 days. And then it's over. That's it. Sebastian paused. Damien, look me in the eye when I say this, even if you have to do it by memory. The man whose father you put on the floor has spent the last 18 years not being what he used to be. He has held himself back from returning to something he was very good at and very terrible for being good at because he made a decision about who he wanted to be. Today you almost undid that. Damien said nothing. You almost turned a good man back into a dangerous one, Sebastian said, because you were drunk and bored and nobody in your life had ever once made it uncomfortable for you to be those things. A pause. Monday, 6 a.m., the back door. Sebastian hung up. Damien sat in his dark apartment with his phone in his hand. He sat there for a very long time. He thought about the old man stepping between him and the waitress. He thought about the way the old man had stood his ground, not aggressively, not with threat, but with the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision and was not available to be moved from it. He thought about hitting him. He thought about the sound of it. He hadn't thought about the sound of it until right now. He'd been running from the sound of it since the moment it happened, filling the hours with Jordan's company and financial news, and not thinking about it. But now it was quiet in his apartment, and he couldn't run from it anymore. The sound of a 79-year-old man hitting a counter. It sat in Damien Varela's chest like something that was never going to move on its own. And at midnight, Elias knocked on the back door of Maybell's. Harold let him in. The diner was closed, the lights down except for the counter fluorescence, the chairs up on the tables. Harold poured coffee, and they sat at the counter together, father and son, the way they'd sat 100 times over the years, and the same way they never quite sat comfortably, because there were always things between them that hadn't been fully said. You talked to Sebastian, Elias said. He came here. I know. He told me. Elias wrapped his hands around the mug. How did that go? Better than I expected, Harold said. He's a man who knows when he owes a debt and how to look at it directly. I respect that. The arrangement? Damien starts Monday. Elias nodded. He drank his coffee. He waited. Because there was something else, and Harold knew he was waiting for it, and Harold was working up to it with the deliberate care of a man approaching something that had weight. You said on the phone there were things you'd never told me, Elias said. Harold set down his mug. He turned on his stool so he was facing his son directly. He folded his hands together on the counter. The bruise around his eye was dark in the fluorescent light, and the athletic tape on his knuckles had started to come loose at one end, and he looked his 79 years in a way that he didn't always the weight of the day visible in him, the accumulated history of it. 25 years ago, Harold said, when you and the Brotherhood shut down Rico Salazar's operation, and when the Varela organization did the same from their side, there was a moment right at the end of it when Rico was contained but not finished. You remember that? I remember. There was a decision made about what to do with him, about whether the situation required something permanent or whether it was sufficient to dismantle everything he'd built and let him go with a clear understanding of what would happen if he rebuilt it. Elias was very still. I was part of that decision, Harold said. Elias looked at his father. Not in the way you're thinking, Harold said immediately. I was not in the Brotherhood. I was never that. But I had relationships at that time with certain people on both sides. I was known to both groups as someone neutral, someone whose word was trusted. He paused. Sebastian Varela brought me in as a mediator because he didn't trust the Brotherhood not to go further than the situation required, and the Brotherhood didn't trust the Varelas not to use the moment to consolidate territory. I was the common point. You were the reason Rico was let go, Elias said slowly. I was part of the reason. I argued for it. I argued that destroying the man was different from destroying his operation, and that destroying the operation was sufficient. Harold's voice was flat, carrying the weight of a man who had revisited this argument in his own mind many times over many years. I was wrong, not about the principle. The principle is still right. But about this specific man, I was wrong. Rico Salazar is not a man who lets things in. Elias absorbed this. He's here because of you. He's here because of the decision I was part of. Yes. Harold met his son's eyes. And because of the history between you and me and Sebastian Varela. He didn't choose this county and this diner by accident. He chose it because we are all connected here and because he understood that a match dropped in the right place would catch. Elias was quiet for a long time. Why didn't you tell me this when I was riding, he said. Because I needed you to ride. I needed you to move towards this, towards Sebastian, toward the conversation, toward the understanding of what Rico was doing without the weight of my history making you second guess every step. Harold's voice didn't waver. And because I am your father, and there are things a father carries so his son doesn't have to, until the moment arrives when the son needs to know. Elias stood up from his stool. He walked a few steps away from the counter. He stood with his back to his father for a moment processing. Then he turned around. There's something else, he said. You didn't tell me everything yet. Harold looked at him, old eyes, tired eyes that had been looking at this son since the son was 2 days old and had been trying to figure out how to protect him ever since. Sebastian Varela, Harold said, has a reason beyond his son's behavior to want peace with this family. A reason he hasn't told you yet. Something from the highway ambush 28 years ago, not 25. The one where your grandfather rode. Elias went still. Sebastian didn't just survive that ambush, Harold said. Someone brought him out of it. Someone who wasn't from the casino side of things and had no obvious reason to pull him out of harm's way. The silence in the diner was total. Your grandfather, Harold said quietly, saved Sebastian Varela's life. Before Sebastian was Sebastian. Before either of them were anything. Your grandfather rode back through a situation that was already over, on a road that had already been abandoned, and pulled a 23-year-old kid out of a drainage ditch and got him to a hospital and never told anyone he'd done it. Elias stood in the middle of his father's closed diner at midnight, and the weight of 28 years of silence settled around him like weather. Sebastian knows, Harold said. He's always known. He found out 8 years later who the rider was. And he has never said it directly to any member of this family because he didn't know how, because in the world he came from a debt that large doesn't have a comfortable language. And now, Elias said slowly, his son put the grandson of that man on the floor of his diner. And now Harold agreed his son did that. Elias looked at his father. This is why he came here himself, Elias said. Tonight. Not an attorney, not a representative. He came himself. He came himself, Harold said, because he has owed this family a debt for 28 years, and he finally had a specific way to begin paying it. And because I think underneath everything Sebastian Varela has spent 3 decades becoming, there is still a 23-year-old kid in a drainage ditch who remembers exactly what it felt like when a stranger rode back for him. The coffee had gone cold. Neither of them moved to refresh it. Outside, somewhere in the dark geometry of Parker County, Rico Salazar was making his own calculations, moving his own pieces, watching the network of connections he thought he had engineered toward collision. He didn't know that the collision had been redirected. He didn't know that the 2 men he'd positioned on opposite sides of a war were currently sitting on the same side of a different table. And he didn't know because he'd never had either a father or a son, and so he had no framework for understanding what was possible when those 2 things were in the same room, that the most dangerous thing in Parker County tonight was not a biker or a casino empire. It was a 79-year-old man who had just told his son the truth, and a son who now understood exactly what needed to be protected and exactly what needed to end. Damien Varela arrived at the back door of Maybell's road stop at 5:58 on Monday morning. Not 6, 5:58. Emily was the one who heard the knock because Harold had sent her to unlock the kitchen entrance while he got the grill started, and when she opened the door and found Damien Varela standing there in work boots and dark jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt with no logos on it, her first thought was that he looked smaller than he had that night. Not physically, he was still the same height, same build, but something about the absence of his friends and his watch and his context had reduced him to his actual dimensions. And his actual dimensions were less impressive than his performance of them had been. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Emily said, "You're early." Yeah, Damien said. Harold's on the grill. Come in. She stepped aside. He stepped in. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the space with the expression of a man who had walked into something and was now understanding that the something was real. Harold turned from the grill. He looked at Damien with the same direct, unhurried attention. He turned on everything, not sizing him up, not performing assessment, just looking at him the way a man looks when he genuinely wants to see what's there. Damien, Harold said, Mr. Mercer. His voice was careful, controlled. Not humble, not yet, because humility was something you arrived at rather than performed at the door, but controlled. Harold pointed to a hook on the wall. Apron's there. Wash your hands at that sink. The soap's on the left. He turned back to the grill. We open in 2 hours. Between now and then, you're going to watch everything I do and not ask me to explain it until I'm done doing it. After that, you can ask. Okay. One more thing, Harold said without turning. You see that girl you just walked past? Damien looked toward Emily, who was pulling plates from the rack. She works here. She has worked here for 2 years and she is very good at her job. In this kitchen, she has more authority than you do, more experience, more knowledge, and considerably more standing. If she tells you to do something, you do it without comment. Damien said nothing. Harold turned around, now spatula in hand. I need a yes from you on that one. Yes, sir, Damien said. Harold turned back to the grill. Emily kept her face carefully neutral, but she pressed her lips together in a way that if she'd been somewhere private would have become a very different expression. The first 3 days were exactly what Harold had predicted they would be. Damien was terrible at the work, not in the ways that could be excused by inexperience. He was also terrible at the ways that came from a man who had never once been required to subordinate his comfort to the requirements of a task. He held dishes like they might transmit something. He refilled coffee with the mechanical precision of someone performing a duty rather than serving a person. When a trucker named Dale asked him twice to wipe down the booth before he sat, Damien did it, but the set of his jaw made clear what he thought of the request. On the second day, an older woman named Mrs. Pacheco came in for lunch. She was 83, a regular, and she had the particular trait of some elderly regulars of treating waitstaff as an extension of her own household staff, not cruelly, just unconsciously, with the assumption of constant availability and unconditional pleasantness. She sent her soup back twice, the first time because it was too hot, the second time because it was then too cold. Emily watched Damien carry the bowl back to the kitchen the second time. She watched his face. She saw the moment. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, where everything in him wanted to say something, to assert something, to establish through language that he was not a person who returned soup twice. He didn't say it. He brought the bowl back without a word, heated it to what Harold told him was the correct temperature, and returned it to Mrs. Pacheco, who said, "Thank you, dear," without looking up from her crossword. Harold noticed. He didn't say anything to Damien about it. But that night when they were doing the close-of-day cleanup, and Damien was mopping the floor with the defeated energy of someone who had just completed the worst day of his recent life, Harold said from behind the counter, Mrs. Pacheco lost her husband in January. She has trouble sleeping, and she comes in for the soup because her late husband used to make it for her on cold days, and she says ours is close. Damien stopped mopping. She's not trying to be difficult, Harold said. She just doesn't have many things left that feel familiar. Damien stood with the mop in his hands. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was different from the careful, controlled voice he'd been using. Quieter, less managed. How do you know that? Because she told me, Harold said simply, because I asked. He turned off the counter lights and went to his office, and Damien stood in the half-dark diner holding a mop and looked at the booth where Mrs. Pacheco had eaten her soup. By the end of the first week, the county had opinions. This was inevitable. Damien Varela working a lunch counter at a roadside diner was the kind of story that traveled fast and generated commentary in proportion to how many people had feelings about the Varela name, which was in Parker County, essentially everyone. The opinions divided roughly into thirds. 1/3 thought it was insufficient, that whatever arrangement had been made was a rich family workaround, a performance of consequence that would last exactly 30 days and change nothing, and that the county was being played for fools in a more elaborate way than usual. 1/3 thought it was exactly right, that there was something satisfying at a deep and not entirely comfortable level about watching the name that had run the county's gravity for 3 decades produce a young man who had to mop floors and carry soup. One-third, which included most of the diner's regular customers, had decided to reserve judgment and instead watch very carefully what Damien Varela did when nobody who mattered to him was watching. Curtis Renner was in that third. He came in every morning at 5:58, as he always did. He ordered his coffee and his biscuits and his sausage gravy, as he always did. And he watched Damien with the patient attention of a man who had spent a year in Vietnam learning to distinguish between people who were performing competence and people who actually had it. On the fourth day, Curtis set his phone on the counter without looking up and said, "You know what I did before I retired?" Damien, refilling his coffee from the wrong side and catching a look from Emily that made him correct his position, said, "No, sir." "Electrician, 40 years. Curtis picked up his coffee. "You know what the first thing is when you are learning to read a circuit? No. You stop assuming you know where the power is and you start finding out where it actually is." Curtis drank. A lot of young men walk into rooms assuming they know where the power is. They're usually wrong. Damien looked at him. For a moment, his face was unguarded, not resentful, not defensive, just receiving the words with an openness that surprised Emily, who was watching from 3 feet away. "You talking about the diner," Damien said. "I'm talking about everywhere," Curtis said. "But the diner works as an example." He went back to his biscuits. Damien went back to the coffee carafe. But something had shifted in the set of his shoulders. Small, barely visible, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't paying attention to the right things. Emily was paying attention to the right things. Baham. On the 8th day, the black SUV appeared. Not Sebastian's. Sebastian's was a known quantity, and Sebastian had kept his word. He dropped Damien off a block away every morning and was gone before the diner opened. This was a different vehicle. Parked across the highway from Maybell's, not in the lot, engine idling in a way that suggested it had no intention of stopping, but every intention of being seen. Harold noticed it at 7:15 in the morning through the front window. He noticed it again at noon. He didn't say anything to Damien about it. He called Elias. Elias was already aware. Webb had flagged it 40 minutes earlier through the same network that had flagged everything else. 2 vehicles, Webb told Elias. "Isayos. This one and one more on the East Road. They're not surveillance. They're too visible for surveillance. They're a message." "Rico's message," Elias said. "Or Rico's proxy's message. Either way, someone wants Harold to understand that the situation is being watched." "Is it escalating?" Not yet." Webb paused. "But there was an incident last night at the storage unit where I've been keeping the network documentation. Someone tried the lock. Didn't get in, but tried." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He knows we're mapping him. He suspects it. He doesn't know how much we have." "How much do we have?" "Enough to establish the current structure of the operation. 3 distribution points in Parker County. 2 along the highway, 1 inside Fort Worth city limits. The highway points are using the same corridor he used 25 years ago. Different personnel, different vehicles, same geography." "He never changes what works," Elias said. "Men like Rico don't. The operation is the operation. They just redecorate." "And found the bar. Still active. Still the social connection to Damien's former circle." Webb hesitated. "There's been contact. Someone from FAM's network reached out to 2 of Damien's friends from that night at the diner, fishing for information about what's happening with the Varela kid." Elias understood immediately. They want to know if Damien's actually changing or if this is theater. And if it's theater, if Damien is just running out his 30 days and goes back to his previous life, then Rico's original plan is still viable. He just needs to wait. And if it's real, then a Varela-Mercer alliance, however informal, built around what's happening at that diner, is the one thing that closes off his operating space permanently. Elias thought about that. So stopping what's happening at the diner is the priority for Rico right now. That's my read. Then the SUVs aren't just a message to Harold. They're a message to Damien. Webb was quiet for a beat. "Yes, I think so." Elias got on his bike. He arrived at Maybell's at 12:40 during the lunch rush. He didn't make an entrance. He came in through the back the way he had since he was a boy. The diner's kitchen had always been his door, never the front because the front was for customers and he was family. He stopped just inside the kitchen and looked through the service window at the dining room. Damien Varela was clearing a table. Not performing clearing, actually clearing stacking plates efficiently, wiping the surface in 2 passes the way Harold had shown him, moving to the next, without pausing to assess whether anyone was watching. It was competent. It was, Elias noted, with something that was not exactly surprise, but was close to it, the work of someone who had stopped fighting the work. Emily appeared at the window. She saw Elias. She gave him the very slight nod of someone delivering a status report without words. The nod said, "He's doing okay, relatively speaking." Elias waited. When the lunch rush thinned, he came through to the counter and sat down. Harold brought him coffee without being asked. Damien, carrying a bus tub to the kitchen, passed within 3 feet of Elias and stopped. They looked at each other for the first time since the morning Elias had walked into the diner and dropped his coffee mug. Damien looked different up close. Not softer, that wasn't the word. Less armored. The expensive watch was gone. The performance of ease was gone. What was left was a 23-year-old who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work hours and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of someone whose primary self-concept was being quietly revised from the ground up. "Damien, Malayan," Elias said. "Mr. Mercer." His voice was steady, not defiant, not ingratiating, just steady. "The black SUV across the road," Elias said. "You've seen it." Something moved in Damien's expression. "I've seen it." "Do you know who it is?" Damien set the bus tub down. He looked at Elias with an expression that was, for the first time in this whole sequence of events, not managing anything. "I've been trying to figure that out. I have some ideas." "Tell me." So Damien told him. What came out was more than Elias expected, because Damien, in 8 days of working the diner and having the performance stripped away layer by layer, had apparently spent a great deal of the mental energy previously used for maintaining his public self on examining the months before the incident instead, on working backward through the social architecture of those months, on tracing who had introduced whom, who had suggested what, who had been where when, which decisions got made. "Derek Pham's bar," Damien said. "We'd been going there for 3 months. Derek kept comping us, kept making it easy to stay easy to drink more than we'd planned. And there was a guy, I only met him twice. I thought he was just another one of Derek's regulars. But looking back, he was always there when something stupid was about to happen. Always just close enough to be in the conversation without being in it." "What did he look like?" Elias asked. Damien described him. Elias looked at Harold. Harold looked at Elias. The description matched. "Rico Salazar," Elias said. "Who is that?" "Someone who has a reason to want you and my family in a war." Damien absorbed this. His jaw moved. He looked down at the bus tub. When he looked up again, his eyes were doing something complicated, processing, recalculating, mapping out the architecture of a manipulation that had used him as its primary instrument without his awareness. "He used me," Damien said. "Islam Alzheimer's." He set the whole thing up. The drinking, the bar making me feel like," he stopped, "like I was untouchable, like the rules didn't apply." "Which you were already inclined to believe," Elias said directly without softening it. Damien took that. He didn't argue with it. "Yeah," he said, "which I was already inclined to believe." Harold from behind the counter said quietly, "Elias." Elias looked at his father. Harold's expression said carefully, "Damien." Elias said, his voice shifting from direct to something more measured. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer it." "Okay. Has anyone from that circle, Pham's people, anyone connected to those 3 months, contacted you since you started here?" Damien was still for a moment. Then he said, "Jordan, one of my friends from that night. He texted me 4 days ago. Said some people were asking about me, asking whether I was actually doing this for real or whether I was just running out the clock." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was doing it for real. And," he laughed. Damien's voice was flat. He laughed and said that was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. The bus tub sat on the counter between them. Outside, somewhere across the highway, the black SUV idled. "They're going to try to pull you back," Elias said, "into the old situation, into your old behavior, because your old behavior is the thing that makes their operation possible." "I know," Damien said. "Do you?" "I said I know." Sharper now, not angry at Elias, angry at something else, at the whole shape of how he'd been positioned and used and the ease with which it had worked. "I'm not an idiot. I made choices that made it easy for someone to use me. I get that. I'm not going to pretend I don't." Harold said from the grill without turning. That's the first genuinely intelligent thing I've heard you say. Damien blinked. Elias almost smiled. All right, Elias said. Then here's what happens next. What happened next required three conversations simultaneously, each one feeding the others, and Elias moved between them across the span of an afternoon and evening, with the particular focus of a man who had spent 18 years learning to think rather than react. The first conversation was with Webb, who by evening had a more complete picture of Rico's current operation, enough to take to law enforcement if the law enforcement in question wasn't under Varela influence, which in Parker County was a significant qualifier. They needed federal channels or nothing. The second conversation was with Sebastian Varela, who took the call at 4 in the afternoon and listened without interruption while Elias laid out what they had on Rico's network. At the end of it, Sebastian was quiet for a moment and then said, I have a contact at the FBI field office in Fort Worth. We used them 3 years ago on a money laundering situation that touched our licensing. They know our organization and they know we cooperated. That works, Elias said. I'll make the call tonight. Sebastian, Elias paused. Your son is doing the work. Another silence. Different quality than the previous ones. I know, Sebastian said. His supervisor tells me. Who's his supervisor? Harold Mercer, Sebastian said, and there was something in his voice that, in a different context, might have been called gratitude. Harold calls me every other night. Not to report, just to. Another pause. He says Damien asked him yesterday why Mrs. Pacheco orders soup on cold days. He told him, and Damien apparently heated her soup to the exact right temperature on the first try. Elias held the phone for a moment. You know something, Mr. Varela? What? My father has been doing this for 22 years, shaping people who walk through that door whether they want to be shaped or not. It's what he does, and he is very good at it. I'm beginning to understand that. Your grandfather would have liked him, Elias said. Then catching himself, your father. I meant your father. No, Sebastian said quietly. You could have meant my grandfather. He would have liked Harold too. A pause. My grandfather was a diner cook for 30 years before any of this. In San Antonio. He fed people who couldn't always pay. He never talked about it as charity. He talked about it as what you do when you can cook and someone's hungry. The line was quiet. I lost the thread of that somewhere, Sebastian said. Across the years. Some threads, Elias said, can be found again. The third conversation was the one nobody planned. It was 9 o'clock at night. The diner had been closed for 2 hours. Elias had stayed because Harold had asked him to stay, and Harold had been doing something in his office that he said would take 20 minutes and had already taken 50. And Emily had stayed because she had nowhere particularly urgent to be, and because, if she was honest with herself, the situation had reached the level of weight where being alone with it felt worse than being present with it. Damien should have been gone an hour ago. Sebastian was supposed to pick him up at 7:30 from the block away. But at 7:15, while Elias was on the phone with Webb and Harold was in his office, Damien had come to find Emily in the kitchen where she was washing the last of the pots. Can I ask you something? He said. Emily turned. She looked at him for a moment, this boy who had grabbed her wrist 3 weeks ago and who had spent the last 8 days carrying her bus tub and stepping out of her way in the kitchen and heating Mrs. Pacheco's soup to the right temperature. Okay, she said. That night, Damien said. He stopped. When I grabbed your wrist. Emily waited. Were you scared? She turned back to the pot she was washing. She took her time with the answer, not because she was managing it, but because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. Not the way you probably think, she said finally. I wasn't scared you were going to hurt me. I've dealt with situations like that before, and I had a read on you as someone who was performing rather than someone who was actually dangerous. Then what? I was tired, Emily said. I was just tired. Tired of calculating how much this particular situation was going to cost me, how much energy, how much management, whether I was going to lose my job over it if I reacted wrong, whether it was going to follow me. She set the pot in the drying rack. When you're a 19-year-old girl working a late shift at a highway diner, a man putting his hand on your wrist without asking doesn't have to be violent to be exhausting. It's exhausting because you have to spend all this energy managing it, managing him, managing the situation, managing yourself, and it's energy you didn't have to spare, and you didn't get to spend it on anything that was actually yours. Damien was quiet for a long time. I didn't think about that, he said. I know you didn't, Emily said, not cruelly, just factually. I wasn't raised to think about that. I know that too, Emily said. I could tell. That's not an excuse. I didn't say it was. She turned to face him. But it's a reason. And reasons are useful because they tell you where the problem actually lives, which is the first step toward fixing it. Damien looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at Emily with the unguarded expression of someone who was no longer performing anything, and the face underneath the performance was younger than he looked on any other occasion. I'm sorry, he said, for what I did to Harold, for what I did to you. Emily held his gaze. I accept that, she said, with the understanding that an apology isn't the end of a thing, it's the beginning. He nodded. She could see that he meant it not as performance, not as the managed sincerity of a man completing a required step. He meant it the way a person means something when they've thought about it long enough that it has become real. He called Sebastian and told him he'd walk home. Sebastian on the other end of the line said nothing for a moment. Then it's 9 miles. I know, Damien said. I'll figure it out. He didn't walk 9 miles, but he did walk 6 blocks before he called for a car, which was the farthest he had ever walked anywhere for a reason that was entirely his own. The threat arrived at 2 a.m. Not a phone call, not a text. A physical note slid under the diner's back door found by Harold when he came in at 4:30 to start the morning prep. 4 words on a piece of paper, handwritten in block letters. 30 days is too long. Harold called Elias. Elias called Webb. Webb said, it's acceleration. He's feeling the pressure of the FBI contact. He's moving faster than he planned. How fast? I don't know. But the note is a shift. Notes under doors are what happens when a man wants you to know he can reach you without having to actually reach you yet. Yet, Elias said. Yet. Elias was already getting dressed. Get the network together, not for action, for presence. I need people around that diner starting tomorrow morning. Visible. Not threatening, not armed, just present. I want Rico to see that the people who would move in a war are choosing not to move, which is a different kind of signal than them not being there at all. Understood. And Webb, the freight yard on the east side of the county, the abandoned one off Route 9. I want to know everything about who's been using it. Why that one specifically? Elias was quiet for a moment. Because 25 years ago, that's where the last part of Rico's operation was run from. He doesn't change what works. The call ended. Elias sat on the edge of his bed in the gray dark before dawn and thought about his grandfather who had ridden back through a situation that was already over to pull a 23-year-old kid out of a drainage ditch. He thought about what that decision had cost his grandfather in time and risk, in the economy of a man's attention in a dangerous situation. He thought about the fact that his grandfather had never told anyone, had simply done it because a person was in a ditch and he could reach them. He picked up his jacket. He picked up the leather vest. He looked at the vest for a moment. Then he put it on and went downstairs and got on his motorcycle and rode through the dark toward a diner where his father was already behind the grill, and the grill was already hot, and the coffee was already being made, because that was what Harold Mercer did. He showed up before he was needed. And it was time Elias decided for the rest of them to do the same. They came in ones and twos, the way weather comes not all at once, not with announcement, but with the steady accumulation of a thing that had been building for a while and had finally arrived. By 5:30 in the morning, there were 6 motorcycles parked in the lot of Maybell's route stop. By 6, there were 9. By 6:30, when the first regulars arrived for breakfast, there were 11 riders sitting at tables and counter stools, ordering coffee and eggs, and talking to each other in low voices. And the presence of them in the diner was less like an occupation and more like a congregation, a group of men who had decided that a specific place required their specific presence and had shown up to provide it without being asked to make a speech about it. Harold moved behind his counter and served every one of them without comment, the way he served everyone efficiently, without theater, with the particular warmth of a man who understood that feeding people was not incidental to who he was, but central. Curtis Renner arrived at 5:58 as always. He looked at the riders. He looked at Harold. He sat down, ordered his usual, and said, "About time." Harold poured his coffee. "Mind your business, Curtis." "This is my business," Curtis said. This diner is my business. Has been for 10 years. He drank his coffee and didn't say anything else, but the way he sat straighter than usual, with the deliberate posture of a man who has decided something about his own position, was its own kind of statement. Damien arrived at 5:58 as well from the other direction and stopped when he saw the motorcycles. He stood outside the back entrance for a moment looking at the lot. Then he went inside. He found Emily in the kitchen already running the dishwasher cycle and pulled his apron off the hook and tied it without being asked. "What's happening?" he said. "Elias's people," Emily said, "for protection." "Protection from what?" She looked at him. "You got a note under the door last night." Damien went still. "What kind of note?" "4 words. Telling your father—" She stopped. "Telling Harold that 30 days was too long." The silence in the kitchen was different from the usual morning silence. It had something in it, the particular quality of a situation that has crossed from uncertain to specific, from potential to actual. "Rico," Damien said. "That's who Elias thinks." Damien untied his apron and retied it tighter with the focused attention of someone converting agitation into purpose. He picked up a bus tub. He pushed through to the dining room and started on the counter setup, without Harold asking, moving through the routine with the competence of someone who had done it enough times that it had become his own. Harold watched him from the grill. He said nothing. But something in his expression shifted small private, the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. Webb called Elias at 7:45. "The freight yard," Webb said. "There was activity last night. 3 vehicles in and out between 1 and 4 a.m. We couldn't get close enough to identify cargo, but the pattern matches the old corridor, same timing, same route in and out." "He's moving," Elias said. "He's moving fast. Whatever the FBI contact spooked, it's pushed him to accelerate the timeline." "How long before the field office can act?" "Sebastian's contact says 48 hours minimum for a warrant package. They need the documentation we have plus their own verification. We may not have 48 hours. "I know." Elias was quiet for a moment, working through it. Rico was accelerating because he felt the walls moving in. Accelerating men made mistakes, but they also took risks they wouldn't otherwise take, which meant the situation at the diner was more volatile than it had been 24 hours ago. "The note was a test," Elias said. "How do you mean?" "He slid it under the door to see how we'd react. Whether we'd pull Damien out of the diner, which removes the whole arrangement, dissolves the Mercer-Varela cooperation, and opens the space back up, or whether we dig in." Elias paused. "We dug in, he'll escalate. When? Soon. Today or tonight." Elias was already moving. "Pull everyone in closer. I want pairs, not singles. And Webb, nobody initiates anything. We hold position until the FBI has what they need. The whole point is that this ends without the war he's trying to start. And if he forces the issue, then we handle it," Elias said. "But we handle it as men who were protecting something, not men who were looking for a fight. There's a difference, and the difference matters." "It always mattered to you," Webb said. "It matters more now," Elias said, "because this time my father is watching." The call that changed the shape of the day came at 2 in the afternoon. It came to Damien's phone, not Elias's, which was the first indication that Rico had mapped the situation more precisely than expected. The caller ID showed Jordan's name, but the voice that spoke when Damien answered was not Jordan's. "Damien." Flat. Male. Unhurried. "You don't know me by name, but you've seen me." Damien recognized the voice after 2 seconds. The bar. Derek Pham's bar. The man who was always close enough to the conversation to hear it. He kept his voice completely even. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something." The voice had the patience of a man who believed he controlled the timeline. "What you're doing at that diner, the 30 days, the aprons, the whole performance, it's touching. It really is, but it ends today." "Does it?" "Your friend Jordan is with me right now. He's fine. He's going to stay fine. But I need you to walk out of that diner in the next 20 minutes and get in the car that's going to pull into the back lot. And I need you to not tell the Mercer people, because if you tell the Mercer people, Jordan's situation changes." The kitchen was quiet around Damien. Emily was 10 feet away, her back to him, working on the prep for the dinner setup. Through the service window, he could see the dining room, the riders at the counter, Harold moving behind the grill with the steady, unhurried authority of a man entirely at home in his own space. "Give me a minute," Damien said. "20 minutes," the voice said. "Back lot." The call ended. Damien stood with his phone in his hand. He thought about Jordan not deeply because he and Jordan had never been deep, but with the specific concern of a person who understood that someone was in a bad situation because of their connection to him. He felt the pull of that concern. It was real. He also thought about what Emily had said to him in the kitchen 8 days ago, about what an apology was the beginning of, not the end of, about what it meant when a person's old behavior was the thing that made someone else's operation possible. He thought about what Elias had said Rico needed Damien's old behavior. The moment Damien stopped being the person he'd been, the leverage disappeared. He walked out to the dining room and found Elias at the counter. He told him every word of the call. He handed him the phone so Elias could see the incoming number. Elias looked at the number, then he looked at Damien. "You could have walked out," Elias said. "I know. Jordan's your friend." "I know that too." Damien's voice was steady, "but walking out is what he needs me to do. And I'm not doing things because someone else needs me to anymore. I'm done with that." Elias was quiet for a moment, holding the phone. "Jordan's going to be fine," Elias said. "Rico needs him functional. He's leverage, not a target." He passed the phone to Webb, who had come off his stool the moment Damien started talking. "We have a location now. The back lot call means there's a car already positioned. Webb, get the plate. On it. And someone tell my father to stay behind that counter no matter what happens next." Harold from the grill said without turning, "I heard that. I'm not going anywhere." "Dad." "I'm not going anywhere," Harold repeated, with the finality of a man who has run out of patience for protective instructions. "This is my diner. I'll be in it." Oh, Chuck. What happened in the next 4 hours would be described differently by everyone who was part of it, which is the nature of events that move fast and require simultaneous attention in multiple directions. The version that mattered most was the version that happened at the freight yard off Route 9. Webb traced the plate to a vehicle registered to a shell company that dissolved in 2021, which was the kind of paper trail that led directly back to Rico Salazar's methodology. Always a layer between himself and the visible record, always deniable, always the same pattern of deniability that had kept him operating in the cracks for 8 years. The freight yard was the operational center. Webb knew it, Elias knew it, and Sebastian Varela, who had spent the afternoon working his FBI contact with the specific focused pressure of a man calling in a debt that had been building for 3 years, had confirmation from the field office that the warrant package was in process. 48 hours had become 6, because Sebastian Varela on the phone with a federal contact was a different instrument than most people anticipated. But 6 hours was still 6 hours, and Rico moved in 2. He moved because Damien hadn't walked out of the diner. He moved because the back lot car sat empty for 20 minutes and then drove away, and the person who had been supposed to be in it was still inside Maybell's route stop, and that specific failure meant the plan had failed, and a man whose plan has failed has 2 choices: retreat or accelerate. Rico Salazar had not spent 25 years rebuilding what he'd lost by retreating. He made 3 calls. The first was to Derek Pham. The second was to 2 men who had been waiting at the freight yard. The third was to a number that Elias's people traced later to a prepaid phone purchased 4 months ago in Amarillo, which connected to 2 more numbers, which connected to the full shape of what Rico had rebuilt. Not large by the standards of major operations, but dense, careful, built for endurance rather than speed. The calls put people in motion. And Elias, who had spent the afternoon not at the diner but positioned at 3 points around the freight yard, with Webb and 4 others, understood from the sudden vehicle movement that the acceleration had begun. He called Sebastian. "It's tonight," he said. "Call your contact. Whatever they have, it needs to move now. They need more time." "We're out of time." Elias's voice was flat and certain. "He's moving cargo right now. If they don't move in the next 2 hours, the evidence leaves the county." Sebastian was quiet for 4 seconds. "Give me 10 minutes. Chino." At the freight yard, the confrontation arrived not as explosion, but as confrontation, the kind that happened when 2 groups of people arrived at the same location from opposite directions with opposite purposes, and the air between them became the thing that determined what happened next. Elias was there. Webb and 4 riders were there. 3 of Sebastian's men were there. Not Varela enforcers in the old sense, but men who were loyal to Sebastian personally and who understood that what was being asked of them tonight was presence, not violence. Enrico Salazar was there. He was smaller than the situation had made him seem. That was always the way. With architects, they were most impressive in the abstract, in the plans they drew and the mechanisms they built. And then you met them in person and found a man in his late 50s with careful eyes and the contained energy of someone who had run on resentment so long it had become his primary fuel source. He had two men with him. He had Jordan standing slightly apart, not restrained, but obviously aware that leaving wasn't available to him. He looked at Elias. He looked at the riders. He looked at Sebastian's men. He recalculated visibly the way a man recalculates when the room has more people in it than his plan accounted for. "This is more than I expected," Rico said. "It usually is," Elias said, "when you've been working from a 25-year-old map." Rico's jaw tightened. "You think you've stopped something. You've delayed it. 6 months a year, I'll find a different route, a different arrangement. You can't close every road." "No," Elias agreed. "We can't close every road, but we can close this one. And we can make sure the federal case that's being built right now includes enough documentation to make rebuilding significantly more difficult than it was the last time." Something moved in Rico's expression. The mention of federal. He hadn't known about the federal contact he'd known about Elias's network. He'd known about Sebastian's cooperation, but he hadn't traced it forward to where those two things together led. "You're bluffing," Rico said. "Song." "Jordan," Elias said without looking away from Rico. "Your phone in your pocket." Jordan, who had been standing very still and looking like a man who desperately wanted to be somewhere else, said, "Yeah. Call anyone you want. Tell them where you are. You're free to go." Jordan looked at Rico. Rico's expression was doing something complicated. Jordan walked. Not fast, then faster, until he was past the circle of people and into the dark beyond the freight yard, and the sound of his footsteps was moving away. Rico watched him go. "You had one move," Elias said. "Using him, he's gone. I have other moves." "You have two men," Elias said. "You have a network that's been documented and is currently being reviewed by people who have the authority to act on what they find. And you have a choice, which is the same choice you had 25 years ago, except this time the people offering it to you have considerably less patience for waiting to see whether you take it seriously." "What choice?" "Stop," Elias said. "End it. Tonight. Walk away from the operation, cooperate with the investigation, and disappear from this county and every county connected to it. Or don't stop and find out what it looks like when two families who should have been enemies decide to be something else instead." Rico looked at him for a long time. He looked at the riders. He looked at Sebastian's men. He looked at the space between them, or all the space that was currently the thing standing between him and a set of outcomes that ranged from manageable to catastrophic. Then he looked at Damien, because Damien was there. He had come with Elias not because Elias had asked him to, but because when Elias was leaving the diner and Damien had said, "I'm coming," Elias had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Stay behind me and don't touch anything," which was the closest thing to permission either of them was going to get. Rico looked at Damien the way you look at a piece that was supposed to be in one position on a board and had moved to another. "You were supposed to be exactly what you were," Rico said, and the bitterness in it was pure and unfiltered, the bitterness of a man whose plan had been precise and elegant and had failed at its most human point. "You were supposed to be exactly what you've always been." Damien met his eyes. "I know," he said. "I'm working on that." Rico made his decision. He made it the way men make decisions when the options have genuinely narrowed. Not with drama, not with a final speech, but with the quiet capitulation of someone who has run the numbers and found that they don't add up the way they used to. He put his hands up. Both men behind him did the same. The FBI arrived 11 minutes later, which was 4 minutes after Sebastian's contact had confirmed the warrant was signed. They secured the freight yards, secured Rico and his two men, and began the process of working backward through the documentation that Elias and Webb had spent 2 weeks assembling. It took the rest of the night. By 4 in the morning, 3 distribution points had been identified and flagged for coordinated action. By 5, the operation that Rico Salazar had spent 8 years quietly reconstructing was being dismantled from 4 directions simultaneously by people with the legal authority to make the dismantling permanent. Elias watched it happen from the edge of the freight yard with his hands in his pockets and his jacket collar up against the November cold, and felt something that took him a moment to identify. It was the specific relief of a man who had gone looking for justice and found it without having to become someone he didn't want to be. He drove back to the diner. Harold was there as Harold was always there because Harold Mercer did not sleep during situations and never had, and he had been behind his counter at Maybell's route stop since midnight, making coffee for whoever needed it, and doing inventory with the systematic focus of a man who needed his hands occupied while his mind was somewhere else. The diner was full in the strange blue hour before dawn, with an assortment of people who had no particular reason to be there except that they needed to be somewhere, and somewhere had become Maybell's road stop on Highway 287 in northern Texas. The riders were there. Sebastian's men were there. Curtis Renner was there because someone had called Curtis at 1 a.m, and Curtis had said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes," without asking why. Emily was there because Emily had been there since midnight and had made the coffee and cleared the cups and done the things that needed doing because that was what Emily Cross did and had always done. Elias walked in through the back. Harold looked up. They looked at each other across the length of the diner, father and son, the way they'd always looked at each other, with the particular complicated love of two people who were more alike than either of them was entirely comfortable admitting. "It's done," Elias said. Harold let out a breath, slow, long, the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. "Anyone hurt?" Harold asked. "No, Elias. "No one, Dad, I promise." Harold nodded. He picked up the coffee pot. He started filling cups. Damien arrived at 5:45, not from Sebastian's car, on foot, which meant he'd walked from wherever Sebastian had dropped him, which given the geography was at least 8 blocks. He came through the back door and he was carrying 2 large supply boxes, the dry goods delivery that was supposed to come at 7, which he had apparently intercepted from the delivery driver and carried himself. He set the boxes down. He tied on his apron. He looked at the diner full of people who had been part of the night he'd just been part of, and he moved to the coffee station and started a fresh pot without being asked. Harold watched him from the grill. Emily watched him from the counter. Curtis Renner on his stool at 5:58, as always, watched him pour the first cup and bring it to the nearest table to one of the riders who was showing his age in the set of his shoulders, and the rider said, "Thank you, son," without looking up, and Damien said, "Yes, sir," and moved to the next table. Harold cleared his throat. "Damien," he said. Damien turned. "Why are you early?" The question was quiet, genuine, the same question Harold asked the morning sky every day when he unlocked the diner. Not "why are you early," but "what brought you here? What kind of man are you becoming? What does it mean that you showed up before you had to?" Damien held the coffee pot in both hands. He looked at Harold Mercer, the bruise around his eye finally fading to yellow at the edges, the athletic tape off his knuckles, now the spatula in his hand and the grill behind him, and the 22 years of early mornings that this specific man represented. He thought about the answer. He didn't reach for the performance of an answer. He reached for the actual one. "Because good men show up before they're needed," Damien said. The diner was quiet. Then Curtis Renner picked up his coffee cup and drank. One of the riders shifted in his seat. Emily pressed her lips together in the way that somewhere private would have been a different expression. Harold Mercer looked at the young man standing in his kitchen, holding a coffee pot at 5:45 in the morning, and something in the old man's face moved, something deep and unhurried and certain, the expression of a man who has spent 22 years believing that people were worth the effort and has just been handed again the proof. He turned back to the grill. "There's biscuit dough in the bowl," he said. "Get it in the oven. We open in 15 minutes. "Yes, sir," Damien said. He set the coffee pot down. He found the bowl. He found the pan. He did the work. Sebastian Varela came in at 7. He sat at the counter, not in a booth, not at a table, but at the counter, the way the regulars sat, the way people sat when they wanted to be in the life of the place rather than apart from it. He ordered coffee. He did not announce himself. He did not reference anything that had happened the night before. When Damien brought him his coffee, Sebastian looked at his son for a long moment. Damien looked back. "You did well," Sebastian said. Not loudly, not for the room, just directly to his son, the way a statement is made when it's meant as truth rather than performance. Damien nodded, set the coffee down. He moved to the next customer. Sebastian watched him go. Then he looked at Harold, who had been watching this exchange from the grill with the expression of a man who has seen exactly what he hoped to see. "You did something I couldn't," Sebastian said to Harold. Harold shook his head. "I didn't do anything to him. The work did it. The people in this diner did it." He slid a plate across the warming rack. "I just kept the door open." "That's not nothing," Sebastian just said. "No," Harold agreed. "It isn't." They were quiet together for a moment. Two men in their 60s, one who had built an empire and one who had built a diner, both of whom had made decisions in their lives that had cost them things they couldn't fully account for, and both of whom were sitting in a roadside diner at 7 in the morning on the other side of a night that had closed something and opened something simultaneously. "My grandfather was a cook," Sebastian said. Harold looked at him. "For 30 years, in San Antonio." Sebastian wrapped his hands around his mug. "He fed people who couldn't pay. He talked about it as what you did, not charity, not virtue, just what you did when you could cook and someone was hungry." Harold nodded slowly. "I want to do something for this diner," Sebastian said. "Not a check, not a renovation, something that—" He paused, searching, "or something that reflects what this place actually is." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You want to know what this diner actually is?" "Yes. It's a place where people who are tired come and have someone pay attention to them for the duration of a meal," Harold said simply. "That's all. That's the whole of it. If you want to do something for it, send me customers who need that. That's the only gift this place can use." Sebastian looked at him. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who has received something worth receiving. "All right," he said. He drank his coffee. He left a tip that was more than the bill, which was not unusual in Maybell's route stop among the people who understood what they were tipping for. The story moved through Parker County the way all the other stories had moved through the invisible network of people who paid attention through the highway dispatch channels, in the feed store conversations, and the text messages passed between people who kept track. But it moved differently this time. Because this story didn't have the quality that made people afraid. It had a different quality, the quality of something that had almost gone one way and gone another. Something that had been aimed at destruction and turned towards something else. That quality was harder to summarize than fear, harder to pass through a text message in 3 words. But it moved anyway because stories that are true and matter always find a way to move. The trafficking network that Rico Salazar had spent 8 years rebuilding was dismantled across 3 counties in the space of 72 hours. 11 people were charged, 4 of whom cooperated immediately, and 2 of whom had information that extended the investigation into adjoining territory. It was not the kind of dismantling that made the evening news. It was the kind that happened in federal documents and case files, and the quiet accounting of law enforcement agencies who had been watching this corridor for a long time and finally had what they needed to act. Rico Salazar got charged. He did not make bail. He had run out of the kind of resources that made bail possible because the resources were part of the operation and the operation was gone. Derek Pham's bar closed 3 weeks later. Jordan sent Damien a text that said, "I heard what happened. I don't really know what to say." Damien replied, "You don't have to say anything. I'll see you around." It was not a reconciliation. It was not a severing. It was the acknowledgement, understated and American, that some things needed time to find their right shape. Curtis Renner, at his counter stool at 5:58 on a Tuesday morning, told Harold that he'd been thinking about volunteering at the Veterans Center on Fridays. Harold told him that sounded like a good idea. Curtis said he'd been putting it off for 2 years. Harold said most good things got put off for too long. Curtis said, "Yeah." Emily Cross enrolled in community college for the spring semester. She didn't quit the diner, she adjusted her hours. Harold adjusted the schedule without comment, the way Harold adjusted everything that needed adjusting, with the practical grace of a man who understood that the people in his diner had lives that extended past his counter, and that was exactly as it should be. Elias stayed. Not permanently, not with a lease and a forwarding address, but in the specific way that a person stays when they've understood something about where they belong. He rode when he needed to ride. He came back when he came back. He called Harold every other day at a time that was late enough that the diner was closed and early enough that Harold hadn't gone to sleep yet, which was a narrow window, and he hit it consistently. He did not put the vest away. But he wore it differently than he had worn it at 28, not as an announcement of what he was capable of, but as a reminder of what he had chosen not to become. There was a difference. It was the most important kind of difference there was. And on the 30th day, the day that Damien Varella's arrangement with Maybelle's route stop was formally complete, Harold Mercer came in at 4:30, as always started the grill, as always has got the coffee going, as always. He did not lock the back door when he came in. He left it open. At 5:43, before the first light was fully established, before any of the regulars had arrived, before anything was required of anyone, the back door opened. Damien Varela walked in carrying 2 supply boxes and a flat of eggs he'd picked up from the overnight delivery because the driver had been running late, and Damien had seen the truck and flagged it down. He set everything down. He washed his hands. He found his apron on the hook where it always was. He looked at Harold. Harold looked at him. "Your 30 days are up," Harold said. "I know," Damien said. Well, he tied the apron strings. He moved to the coffee station and started the morning pot. Harold watched him for a moment. Then he turned back to the grill. His hands moved with the authority of a man who had been doing this specific work for 22 years, in this specific place, for the specific reason that people needed someone to show up and do it. The coffee began to move through the machine. The grill came up to heat. Outside, the highway was waking up, and the first light was finding the edge of the horizon, and the little bell above the front door of Maybelle's route stop was absolutely still in the early morning air, waiting for the first customer who needed what the diner had always had to give: a cup of coffee and a place to sit, and a person who paid attention. Harold Mercer had built this place on a simple truth, and the truth had held for 22 years, and it would hold for however many years were left. A man was not measured by the room he commanded, or the fear he generated, or the name that opened doors. A man was measured by who felt safe when he walked in. And in the diner that morning, at the beginning of the 31st day, every person who would come through that door, tired truckers and old veterans, and single mothers counting their change, and young men still figuring out what they were, every one of them would find the same thing waiting. Somebody had already shown up. The coffee was already made, and the door was already open.